So Lucy Suchman, it's a great pleasure to have her here. She's a professor of sociology at the University of Lancaster, also co-director of the Centre for Science Studies. Her work has been on ethnographies of everyday practice and their relationship to new technology design, ethnographies of sites of technology production and use. Lots of publications, only one of which I'll mention, which is her book, Human-Machine Reconfigurations, Plans and Situated Actions, which the second edition of which came out in 2007. So Lucy's title is Consuming Anthropology.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to try to sit, but I'll project, and I hope that's okay for you in the back. Well, I'm going to, just to start off immediately, differentiating the position that I'm going to be approaching this topic from the history that Pete laid out. I'm going to be addressing less questions of the state than questions of the so-called private sector. And not coincidentally, I'm going to be basing my remarks in the United States. So I hope that while it's going to be perhaps somewhat oblique in terms of its relationship to the context that Pete's provided, that it will be oblique in a generative way, and that will open up more topics for our discussion. So this series, as I understand it, is aimed at exploring the trope of impact, and more particularly, as it said in the text for the series, the relationship between intellectual activity, academic institutions, and the public good. So I take it that one of our aims is an analysis of this term of impact and the work that it does in figuring relations among different sites, practices, commitments, and the like. I can't deliver that fully today myself, but I'd like at least to preface my paper with a few observations, rather obvious perhaps, but I think still worth stating. Most obviously, this term that frames our agenda presumes the existence of some form of mass, more specifically a projectile, something launched or thrown or at least let loose from one place, which then arrives in and leaves a mark on another. This presupposition in turn enacts boundaries, a separation between different locales. It designates one of those locations as originary, the other as a target. And it figures whatever is transferred between the two as a discrete and alienable object that can, returning us to the starting premise, be thrown, or perhaps more gently at least, handed off from one place to another. I take this seminar to be, at least in part, about the question of how we might refigure this powerful trope, which increasingly frames us, our labors, and our relations, in the interest of reconceiving how things come into being, circulate, and have effects, and not just generally, but in the service of the public good. I'll try to address this question myself from a particular background of experience, one that I hope might help us to articulate these figurations and their effects. A warning in advance is that I may offer up a view of the academy that seems overly optimistic to those of us engaged in important critical work with respect to the university as an institution that is itself and increasingly implicated in the problems that worry us. But I'll try to offer some rationale for placing my hopes, at least in part, on these grounds, both figuratively and literally. Through a history traceable at least to labor struggles of the 1930s, American anthropologists have worked to legitimize themselves as relevant to industry. And I should say that I'm in the sociology department at Lancaster, but I am an anthropologist, which is why I'm focusing on that here. My focus in this paper is on a recent chapter in this history, the incorporation of anthropology as both figure and practice within industrial research and development in the United States beginning in the 1970s. More specifically, I'm interested in the frames within which anthropology is imagined as valuable to contemporary industry, particularly in the area that I know best, the design of information and communications technologies. One strategy for addressing these questions is to think about the embedding of anthropological research within corporate enterprise in relation to the turn to markets as a research object in the social sciences. Writing against the tradition of classical economics, particularly in its separation of the economy from society or culture, recent scholarship has developed the argument that economic and cultural activities are inseparably interrelated. Don Slater, for example, reminds us that identifications of products, markets, competitors, and the like fundamentally presuppose the mobilization of cultural knowledge, that is, the persuasive assertion of qualities of sameness and difference between relevant objects. Figured as the expert on culture, it follows that the anthropologist would have an obvious currency in the making of markets. Indeed, in the service of making a space for workplace ethnography during the 1980s, my colleagues and I at Xerox Palo Alto Research Center, which I'll refer to as PARC from here on, framed our arguments in terms of the relatively greater value of ethnographically based attention to everyday practice over the kinds of decontextualized opinions and fragmented expressions of preference elicited through market research. The anthropological promise was to recontextualize objects in meaningful social and material practice through ethnographic fieldwork. However much the results of those investigations might then have to be translated back into commercially relevant terms in order to be useful for other actors like designers, product managers, marketers, and the like. Whatever might be lost in translation, and the loss of contingency is a requirement for translational efficacy, fieldwork's capture of the elusively cultural should afford insights and opportunities not available through any other means. That was our pitch. But I'm getting ahead of my story. Anthropological engagement at Xerox PARC began in the summer of 1976 on the initiative of Jeff Rulofson, a computer scientist and research manager. Before coming to PARC, Rulofson had worked with Douglas Engelbart on the Augment project at Stanford Research Institute, a source for many of the imaginaries and technologies that comprised at the time the Office of the Future. The founding of PARC in 1970 was itself symptomatic of Xerox's early concerns with its place in that future. In an interview that I did with Rulofson in 2003, he explained that he was deeply dissatisfied with the office modeling on offer from consulting firms hired to advise the corporation on technology strategy. Searching for alternatives, he was inspired by his readings of Levi-Strauss, from whom he took the lesson that, in his words, we are our tools. He turned to his academic networks in the San Francisco Bay Area in an effort to identify an anthropologist who might be interested in research on office work in the context of new technology development. Knocking on doors at the University of California at Berkeley, he met Eleanor Wynn, then a graduate student in linguistic anthropology, who signed on for a summer contract. The following summer, Rulofson sponsored a second round of studies, once again arranged through UC Berkeley. This time, a team of 3 graduate students were placed in Xerox branch sales offices for 6 weeks, with the assignment to examine the informal procedures in social relations comprising the work of customer service. In their account of the project in the journal Central Issues in Anthropology, Carol Browner and Michael Chibnick distinguished 2 aspects as unique at the time with respect to anthropological research. First, adapting anthropological methods for use in a business setting, and second, conducting research for a profit-making corporation. They report that the first proved relatively easy, the second more problematic. Observing that the 1970s was a time of decreasing opportunities in the academic job market for anthropology, which seems to be an eternal state, they cite other publications by anthropologists engaged in non-academic research at the time, that is in government, nonprofits, private consultancies, which reported a number of difficulties, including political pressures, conflicting responsibilities to subjects and sponsors, and the need to present findings of practical value within short time frames. In the context of corporate-sponsored research, they observe practical value translates to profitability. The research group to which they reported, which they pseudonymed the Center for Office Studies, was engaged in developing information systems designed to transform administrative work and organizational communications more broadly from paper to digital media. The field site for the study, which was also the site of ongoing observations of paper flow as it was conceptualized by computer scientists in the research group, was a corporate branch office devoted to sales and customer service, also slated as the test site for the introduction of a prototype information system the following summer. The prototype configured Park's Alto mini computer into an administrative workstation running Office Talk, software created using the Smalltalk programming language, also under development at Park. The justification for the anthropological initiative was framed with reference to problems that had arisen with the introduction of earlier computer-based office equipment, specifically word processors, and corporate concerns that these problems might repeat themselves. In a presentation to the anthropologists, Jeff Rulofson explained that he believed that these problems were due less to technical shortcomings of the equipment than to a flawed model of the work, focused only on the individual user's relation to the machine rather than the broader social relations of the office. Quote, "The effect of installing new machines," he speculated, "may be that they interfere with, or at least change, the way people work together." Those were his words. Rulofson pointed out that while we know that work goes on in offices, little is known about how it actually gets done. For example, the informal procedures used to carry out tasks, the social relations necessary to carrying out procedures, or the effects that changes in routines might have on getting the work done. Social anthropologists seem potentially able to provide information on these issues that would be relevant to the design of information systems. Much of this perspective was likely due to Rulofson's engagement with Eleanor Wynne, whose contract the previous summer had resulted in subsequent support for her dissertation on the importance of informal office conversation in the communication of business-relevant information. As the champion of the project, Rulofson saw his engagement of anthropology as putting Xerox PARC on the cutting edge of social science research. Browner and Chivnik report that he announced to others regarding his employment of anthropologists that, quote, "the best that are," in the name of the chief competitor, "the best our chief competitor has done is an industrial psychologist." His main concern was to show that this, in his words, crazy project of placing anthropologists in branch offices could actually be done. Following a summer position in 1978 as a research assistant to Eleanor Wynne, I became a summer intern in Rulofson's group in 1979 and subsequently completed my own dissertation at Park. So with this brief origin story as background, I fast forward to the 1990s. The office of the future, at least in its paperless imagining, is a thing of the past, while digital systems comprise an unremarkable, albeit continually changing medium of administrative work. 15 years after the dissolution of the Center for Office Studies in 1980, the Systems Science Laboratory, of which it was part, is now the Knowledge and Practices Laboratory, and the Work, Practice, and Technology Research Area, established in 1989 and of which I'm the group manager, is in place. A small research group comprising 4 anthropologists and 2 computer scientists, we mobilize arguments about the value of ethnographically informed co-design of prototype technologies to industrial research and development. Creating and iteratively refining these arguments is an integral part of our work. Along with concrete demonstrations of an associated research practice, these arguments opened a space for a range of collaborations: critical engagement with cognitive and computer scientists around questions of intelligence, knowledge, reasoning, and related constructs, collaboration with system designers aimed at respecifying central issues for them, including the human-machine interface, usability, and design expertise, extensive studies of work settings oriented to articulating technologies as socio-material practice, engagement with an emerging international network of computer scientists and system designers committed to more participatory forms of system development with relevant workers, users, activism within relevant computer research networks to raise awareness of these alternatives, and iterative enactment of an ethnographically informed participatory design practice within the context of the research center and the wider corporation. These efforts took advantage of the ways in which our position at Xerox PARC in its identification as a center for basic research and of its members as academically recognized scientists, afforded us what Barry and Slater have called margins of maneuver to sustain affiliations that overflowed the conventional market frame. In particular, we drew the model for our own practice from colleagues in Denmark, Norway, and Sweden, academic computer scientists collaborating with Scandinavian trade unions to develop union-sponsored demonstration systems informed by values of quality of working life and workplace democracy, something that was not going on in the United States at the time. In our representations of the value of participatory design to the corporation, however, political values were minimized in favor of potentially superior design outcomes, producing information systems better suited to working practices. While this strategy and the extended history of collaborative experimentation and engagement through which it was realized over 2 decades was unquestionably fruitful, it also raises a number of questions that have yet, in my reading, to be fully or clearly articulated in recent writings on interdisciplinarity and its impacts. And it's to those questions that I turn in the remainder of this paper. In an interview published in 2002, Michel Callan reflects on the question of, quote, how social scientists can link themselves to social actors, end quote. The reference case for Callan is activists engaged in working for recognition of and resources for orphan diseases like muscular dystrophy, for which mass production medical and pharmaceutical research and development is not profitable. Callan urges social scientists to engage in collaborative partnerships with such groups. But in response to this, Andrew Barry, Callan's interlocutor, asks the crucial question: which actors do you cooperate with, and with which do you not cooperate? One of the problems that Barry's question raises is that of sponsorship and associated accountabilities. Many writings on the virtues of social scientists' engagement with other social actors, a category that I return to in a moment, assumes either that researchers will be based in an academic institution or that where researchers are based is not a critical question. I would like to suggest that this is perhaps the critical question. Without in any way diminishing the extraordinary creativity and commitment with which anthropologists working in industry have managed to open a space, not only for constructive, but even for critical and oppositional work within what Judy Wiseman has named the engine rooms of technological production, I focus here on the contradictions that frame that work and that are deeply woven into the everyday experience of doing it. Unless we explicate those contradictions, we are obscuring the conditions within which impact has emerged as a good in contemporary discourses, and the realities of what it means to enact it, particularly in the constitution of markets. I want to return then to Callan's urging that social scientists link themselves to social actors, to look more closely at the differences that are made in this statement with its call to connection. Most obviously, there is the implication that the social scientist is somehow not herself a social actor, at least in the sense that Callan has in mind. Presumably, the latter are actors whose primary identifications and commitments are to something other than social science, to lobbying for recognition and resources for a disease that overflows the frame of the market, for example. The former, in turn, are actors whose identifications and commitments are to an ongoing engagement with the concerns of the academy, or at least of the historical disciplines from which they draw inspiration and to which they want their work to contribute. It is here, in part, I would argue, that questions of sponsorship matter. That is to say, these distinctions become more complicated, slippery, and problematic when the social scientist is incorporated economically into an organization committed to operating in the market at the same time that she is committed to expanding and redrawing that frame. Another example might help to make this clear. It is 1995, and Xerox Corporation has undergone a massive rebranding initiative aimed at establishing itself as the document company, imagining the document now as an object that moves seamlessly between paper and digital media, facilitated by networks of so-called multifunction devices able to copy, print, scan, and fax as needed. 4 of us are embarked on a project that is the latest in a series aimed at enacting an interdisciplinary design practice that mobilizes ethnographically informed studies of work to create prototype document systems designed cooperatively with their prospective users. These case-based prototypes, as we call them, comprise the medium through which already existing work practices and materials can be reconfigured into systems incorporating both off-the-shelf and also emerging technologies to create technologies that make sense and are useful, while also acting as demonstrations for multiple audiences of new technological possibilities for the integration of paper and digital documents. Like the technology prototype that is its object, the project itself is designed to do multiple kinds of work. One aim is that this project should expand the boundaries of our last. More specifically, that we should go beyond a demonstration prototype, albeit one that was installed temporarily in the workplace of our collaborators, to a prototype that is fully usable and integrated into the wider infrastructure of our user collaborators' workplace. A second is that we extend our growing understanding of document work practices, specifically in relation to what we're at this point calling working document collections, that is, corpora of documents that exist between the desktop and the archive, the filing cabinet being the canonical example. With high value now placed within Xerox on strong endorsements from the corporation's product divisions, we've designed the project as well to engage with the currently most politically salient of these through our choice of workplace, a large state agency considered an important market segment, and the positioning of the prototype as part of a wider configuration that would incorporate the latest product line of multifunction machines. While the project that unfolds is a complex and fascinating one, I focus here on the particular kinds of exchange relationships involved. Figured as a prominent customer, the California Department of Transportation, or Caltrans, had long been a site for significant installations of company products. This formed the initial basis for its currency as a prospective site of our research engagement, a possibility that we pursued through the sales manager dedicated to the Caltrans account. This contact, along with the social capital afforded by our status as researchers at Xerox PARC, secured us a meeting with senior Caltrans management in District 4, the nearest agency headquarters located in Oakland, California. While our identification with Xerox, and more specifically with PARC, was what made us legible to Caltrans management, that identification framed as well the challenge for our first meeting. In contrast to the familiar relationship of technology vendor and customer, we placed a proposal for a different kind of relationship onto the table. Most notably, this would be a relationship in which no money would change hands, but rather only an exchange of time and labor. As salaried PARC researchers, we would require no payment from Caltrans and would offer whatever expertise we could bring to bear for free. In exchange, we asked for an opportunity to work closely with a civil engineering team within the department over an extended time frame. Our subsequent engagement continued for 2 years, to identify some aspect of their document-related work that might benefit from translation between paper and digital media, and to collaborate with them to develop a demonstration system. The latter would not, we emphasized, be a working system in the sense of a purchasable product, but it would be developed sufficiently to be put into real use in situ. What we hoped Caltrans engineers and management would gain by the end of the project was first a deeper understanding of their requirements for a document system that would be genuinely useful and usable within the context of an engineering team's daily work. And second, they would gain a realistic appreciation for the state of the technological art, including relevant technologies already available, those currently in research and development, and others often promised but likely never to be realized. Taken together, we suggested, these would place the organization in a stronger position from which to think about their technology strategy and to assess the claims of future technology vendors who came along. In place of familiar relations of paid services, or products for sale, in other words, we set up a kind of barter, exchanging labors for labors. Our exchange eventually included as well a small suite of gifted technologies, a scanner and a dedicated personal computer along with the requisite software that was necessary for the prototype that emerged. And procuring these technologies from Xerox without charges to Caltrans was among the more substantial of the practical challenges and achievements of our own labors on the project. While conscientiously aligned with the evident commercial interests and prevailing practices of the corporation in some, the project that unfolded overflowed that frame as well. As a consequence, we found ourselves positioned at the interstices of received categories for economic exchange, both in relation to the site of our collaborative prototyping effort, some within Xerox management believing that Caltrans should be paying us, and in the technologies created. Questions like, under what precedent could the hardware be donated? Should and could the software developed in the context of the prototype be patented and licensed as intellectual property? If so, what was the status of the prototype system installed for free at Caltrans? Our successful negotiation of these questions was a prerequisite for and an integral aspect of the creation of a space, albeit a temporary and experimental one, for a different kind of market within the market frame, a form of exchange that didn't fit, but that was necessary for the kind of project to which we were committed. With these fragments of a history of specific anthropological encounters in mind, I turn back to the question of anthropology's value as a consumable within U.S. industry. Recent contributors to the cultural economy discussion argue for the importance of documenting the performative naturalization of economic objects as a basis for their contestation. In Don Slater's analysis, for example, product definition, positioning, branding, and marketing are all constitutive activities in the stabilization of commercial actors and organizations, as well as their objects. So how does this apply to anthropology itself? On February 24th, 1991, an article appeared in the business pages of the New York Times in the managing section titled, quote, "Coping with Cultural Polyglots." The article by reporter Claudia Deutsch told of a small, but by implication increasing, number of anthropologists employed by major corporations. It was an article about our group. 20 years after its first citing, the commercial market for anthropology is still news. An article in Business Week published in 2006 with the title "The Science of Desire" drew the following account of anthropology's popularity. Quote, "Closely observing people where they live and work," say executives, "allows companies to zero in on their customers' unarticulated desires. This makes anthropology far more valuable." We think back to Rulofson's statement in the 70s about getting the edge on the psychologists. The New York Times translates this added value as a matter of the difference between behavioral sciences of the individual versus the group, asserting that, quote, "Until recently, anthropologists, people trained to analyze group behavior, were spurned by corporations, which preferred to stress individuality and entrepreneurship." This is media coverage. Along with the somewhat peculiar disciplinary characterization and history on offer here, the proposition that anthropologists were actively spurned by the corporate world rather than simply being invisible to it is tied to the suggestion that anthropology's embrace is indicative of some newfound interest in the social, even maybe some newly emergent sociality in corporate affairs. As signaled by their common resort to colonialist cliché, it is the promise of access to territories beyond the boundaries of the familiar that most obviously dominates these media reports of anthropology's value. We have here then a resonance with the social sciences' own observation of the turn to a cultural economy. Anthropology is taken by business as emblematic of the capacity of the social sciences, specifically new methods of observation, to aid in the expansion and deeper penetration of cultures of capitalism, a topic about which Nigel Thrift has written. Even more than the social, it is the cultural that enters the picture as the residual category left over after the psychologists and industrial sociologists are done with their work, the mysteries of which it is now the anthropologist's job to make accessible. The Times article explains that, quote, "Most anthropologists study exotic cultures in faraway places," end quote, and accounts for the interest in anthropologists on the part of management as a desire of those who want to expand their operations overseas to understand other cultures, while, quote, "At home, the same companies want help dealing with workforces that are increasingly polyglots of cultures and behaviors," end quote. Globalization, in sum, brings the exotic other into one's line of sight wherever it falls, whether far away or close to home, and the anthropologist is the logical choice to aid in the process of learning to deal with these new multicultural challenges. While the promise of her unique expertise may provide the rationale for the anthropologist's employ, however, the fascination of that employment for the media lies in the unlikely juxtaposition of anthropologist as investigator of exotic other with anthropologist as exotic other in the mundane, familiar halls of the corporate workplace. The interest in corporate anthropology involves the anthropologist herself in an identity marked as exotic other, in other words, within the context of familiar commercial and technological worlds, an other brought home to live inside and become part of the enterprise. My colleagues and I experienced this quite directly as we found ourselves, even after many years, being hailed by some of our computer science colleagues at Park if we happened to walk down the hall together with the only semi-ironic warning, "Here come the anthropologists." We ultimately took this thinly veiled reference to the Jets to heart, donning satin gang jackets with our group name emblazoned on them. As we've seen, this warning, half promise, half portent, is reflected clearly in the texts of the media reports as well as in their titles. With this said, I want to suggest that the anthropologist's interest for the media derives not only from her promise of special access to the user-consumer, or even from her own unlikely appearance in the halls of corporate office buildings, but perhaps most importantly from the ways in which her traditional associations transforms her objects of study from banal to exotic through her interests in them. That is to say, the anthropological gaze, insofar as it's defined by its traditional attention to the other, vicariously renders exotic those on whom it's turned. Factory floors, corporate offices, and middle-class homes, assumed to be so transparently familiar as to not warrant anthropological attention, are turned into sites as foreign as the colonies once were by the mere fact of the anthropologist's presence. In her making of the familiar strange, the presence of the anthropologists in the tribal office transforms what goes on there, the banal and ordinary activities of the working day, into something mysterious and correspondingly interesting. The anthropologist, in short, renders us, the reader addressed by these media stories, as exotic other. The appearance of these accounts in the 1990s makes clear that, however specific in their details, our peculiar histories were also part of some general trends, shifts in rhetorics and practices of multinational corporate enterprise at the close of the 20th century. A crucial element of brand building in an age of mass production and competitive marketing is the manufacture of difference, based less in products than in the packaging of products and their association with recognizable images. Starting in the 1940s, brand evolved from a mascot or catchphrase on a label to the identity of the corporation itself. It's here as well in the early 1990s that we find the rise of lifestyle marketing, increasingly high-concept advertising, and the first initiatives in the design of shopping experiences. As Celia Lurie sums these developments, the market exchange is now a matter, quote, not merely of calculation, but also of affect, intensivity, and the reintroduction of qualities, end quote. And the performativity of the brand, Lurie observes, depends on the compulsory inclusion of consumers as information sources, insofar as, quote, information about consumers is used as a basis for multiplying the qualities or attributes of the product and managing relations between these multidimensional variables in time, end quote. The brand under the sign of relationship marketing works to entangle the consumer in an exchange that extends beyond any specific object or any given transaction. It's surely no coincidence, then, that it is around this same time that the media begin to proclaim the discovery by industry of the discipline of anthropology. The reinvention of the consumer as a social, cultural, rather than strictly rational actor in contemporary economic and marketing imaginaries is both a condition of possibility and the central charge for the anthropologist figured as the medium through which the consumer can be known within or translated into sites of production. The anthropologist as brand performs a kind of interface, at once connecting producer and consumer, and through her mediatory role, helping to limit and make manageable their interaction. The anthropologist's relations to the making of brands is a reflexive one, in other words, insofar as her own brand efficacy operates through the promise of its contributions to this same process. Typically applied to an association of images and things, an interweaving of signs and commodity objects, I'm suggesting that we consider the brand as taking persons, or more accurately disciplines, as its object. So what does this mean for us, for those of us concerned about these appropriative translations of anthropology, but at the same time not wishing to be drawn into exercises of purification or the policing of disciplinary boundaries? Our work as anthropologists sits uncomfortably inside the close-knit interweaving of consumer experience understood as something prior, discovered through anthropological investigation, and then addressed by design and marketing, and consumer experience understood as constituted through activities of design and marketing in their contributions to the creation of desire and the crafting of cultural imaginaries. I do not believe that we can resolve this tension, but as in our subject positions as employees or as consumers, our problem as anthropologists is at least to find the space that allows us to refigure the projects of those who purchase our services and from whom we buy, rather than merely to be incorporated passively within them. I turn in closing to the tricky borderlands that differentiate two modes of collaboration across difference. The first assumes the existence of a priori truths and the project of interdisciplinarity as an instrument for their discovery. The second, based on Helen Verron's construct of working disparate knowledges together, assumes the irremediable multiplicity of the real and reconciliation as too often the product of power-differentiated translations of one party's knowledges into the terms of another's. Rather than reconciliation, then, working knowledges together aims at possibilities for what Marilyn Strathern has identified as partial, practical connections. Translation has little tolerance for the persistence of differences that challenge the foundations of claims to universal knowledge. Partial connection takes the negotiation of difference as an ongoing foundation for getting on together. Translation insists that politics should be suspended from the space of collaboration, and therefore must repress them. Partial connection operates on careful attention to the politics of difference. In the case of Xerox PARC and of collaborations between computer and social scientists more broadly during the 1980s and 1990s, two modes of interdisciplinarity were in tension. One general and programmatic, the other specific and practical. By the mid-1990s, programmatic debates over the relation of computer and social sciences held at major research conferences in the previous decade, on which I had participated in many, had largely been replaced by reports on practical experiments in working together computational, engineering, and anthropological knowledges with those of practitioners in a range of sites to explore inventive configurations of relevant information technologies. Within Xerox PARC, the tropes of knowledge and practice were now conjoined in our laboratory's very name. On the face of it, then, it would seem that arguments reiterated over the preceding 15 years had been fully embraced. My experience, in contrast, was that the space of interdisciplinarity and difference in some respects closed down as the trope of practice was embraced. As the latter became the general rubric for knowledge-making, alternate and contested readings of what research and scholarship on practice might entail were more threatening to what should now be an emerging consensus. Nigel Thrift helps to contextualize this experience for me in his analysis of what he names recent tendencies in contemporary capitalism. The first, seemingly far removed from the enterprises of the Silicon Valley, apart from the endless need of high technology for more materials, like aluminum, coltan, and so forth, comprises further intensification of resource extraction, involving, as he points out, quote, forced dispossession and enclosure as part of a search for mass commodities like oil, gas, gems, and timber, using all the usual suspects, guns, barbed wire, and the law, end quote. The second tendency, clearly much closer to home, he identifies as projects of social engineering, designed to accelerate creative collaboration and, we'll note here, improve on the social sciences' economic impact. It is within this nexus of designs and desires, during a time when profitable returns on investment among established technology manufacturers grew ever more difficult to achieve, that our work and the wider brand of corporate anthropology was formed. At the same time, our identification as anthropologists relied on continuing engagement with developments within the academic discipline of anthropology, where increasingly incisive critiques of contemporary capitalism, including the tendencies that thrift identifies, were under construction. So as the program within the laboratory was in the process of developing its own orthodoxies, including the embrace of the social sciences, the space in which to question received assumptions regarding the politics of corporate anthropology seemed to diminish. Where before we had been enrolled in what was clearly an agonistic form of interdisciplinarity, we were now asked to contribute to an apparently cohesive undertaking. While the former could be negotiated based on partial connections, the latter demanded modes of loyalty that seemed to make our own differences increasingly indigestible. Perhaps most obviously absent from discourses of the research laboratory was any critical discussion of the political economies to which our work was increasingly accountable. As the corporation's performance on Wall Street, which was a topic of little or no interest to researchers when I arrived at Park in the late 1970s, became a constant preoccupation with stock prices and business analyses being discussed at every lab meeting, there remained deafening silence regarding any critical analysis of developments in the world economy and financial markets. To engage in such critique was treated as anachronistically naive at best, or biting the hand that feeds you at worst. So what could it mean to treat these tensions as productive? In their discussion of constructions of capitalism as a singularity, whether by enthusiasts or by anti-capitalist critics, feminist economist J.K. Gibson Graham observed that, quote, "If there is no singular figure, there can be no singular other. Theorizing capitalism itself is different from itself, as having, in other words, no essential or coherent identity, multiplies infinitely the possibilities of alterity," close quote. We might apply the same observation to the disciplines. Like corporations and markets, disciplines are enacted and multiple. And practices, including economically relevant practices, invariably overflow the frames of any single account. In John Law's words, they enact complex interferences between orders or discourses. Multiplying the possibilities requires articulating the frames and the overflows that comprise markets, disciplines, and the micropolitics of economies of knowledge, including close attention to their differential constitutions of value or of the good. It is in this respect, I would argue, that however subject to creeping neoliberalism and corporatization, the academy as an institution still affords frames of reference and accountability importantly different to those of industry. Most concretely, in the latter, there are few bases for protesting growing corporatization, demands for profitable entrepreneurship and the like. Those are rather the primary social responsibility of the corporate citizen. Historical commitments of the academy to education, understanding the human condition, the public good, can commensurately be invoked as grounds for resistance. These are differences in charter, I would argue, that make a difference in the forms of action that they at least potentially legitimize and underwrite. There is a difference that matters between normative research enlisted in the service of agendas, whether public or private, in which the frame is not itself open to question, and research that affiliates with efforts to question the frames within which politics, markets, or any other entities are disciplined. The history of anthropological research conducted under industry sponsorship makes evident both the possibilities for generative interference that come with anthropology's promise of reframing, as well as the tricky politics and frictions of its incorporation. Commerce and politics get both entangled and obscured in contemporary calls for impact. We need to distinguish between calls for value in the sense of utility and a recognition of values as inextricable from the conduct of research. Thanks.
Thank you very much.